Greetings of peace, everyone, and salamu alaikum and welcome, and everyone for joining us in this final webinar. This is our final webinar of the series on African American Muslims and intra-Muslim racism. To quickly review where we're at before we begin, in July, in response to Black Lives Matter protests, ING, or Islamic Networks Group as we're known, which ordinarily does work in education and community engagement to counter Islamophobia and all forms of bigotry, looked inward at the Muslim American community from which we came and asked, what have we done at ING to counter racism within our own ranks? We looked at what we had to offer and created this series. Our first webinar on July 15th explored the history of Islam in America, which began with enslaved Muslim Africans. Our second webinar on July 29th explored some of the institutions and thought leaders, both men and women, of the African American Muslim communities today. Our third webinar on August 12th introduced the topic of racism in the United States, discussing how the concept of race was constructed, the process of racialization, and the impact that racism has had on various groups of Americans. And our fourth webinar, which was a couple of weeks ago on August 26th, addressed intra-Muslim racism, which was based on a blog post I wrote that presented questions that Muslim American communities needed to ask themselves to determine whether they have a problem with racism against African American Muslims. Ishaq or Rahima, if you could actually post that blog post in the comments of the webinar, that would be great if as we go through this. And so today, this brings us to today, our last webinar in the series, which will address what people can do to begin the process of addressing their own internalized anti-Black racism. Before I introduce our first speaker, let me first define what racism is. Racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or an directed against the person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized, such as Black Americans in the United States. Now, it's important to recognize that actions that disadvantage people because of their skin color are racist, whether intentionally so or not. And I know that this is a very sensitive topic because the vast majority of people, when asked whether they're racist or not, will insist they are not. And I was one of those people, okay? Several years ago, and this is a confession I'm gonna make, several years ago, I was accused of being a racist by a young progressive Arab leader after I criticized the prominent Black speaker for his style of speaking that I felt was out of place in what I consider to be an academic setting. My immediate reaction to the charge of racism was very typical. I denied it vociferously. I felt deeply angry with this Arab woman making the charge. And then I proceeded to contact all my Black friends to get them all to say that I wasn't a racist, and they obliged because they're very nice people. And then I went about proving to myself that I wasn't a racist by overcompensating in my interactions with Black Americans. That charge of being a racist deeply impacted me, especially because I do Islamophobia work, I do anti-racism work. And it wasn't until I read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo that I understood what this Arab woman was saying to me. I was absolutely wrong in my criticism of the Black leader's style of speaking, and the woman who criticized me was absolutely right. And I think everyone should read White Fragility, including Arab and South Asian Muslims, not just white folks. However, despite that, just a few months ago, when even after having read several books and attending workshops on anti-racism that took place over the last few months, a Black leader described his experience of my racist attitudes at a meeting that he had attended with me about 25 years ago. And how do you think I reacted then, after having done all this work? I didn't react very well, despite the work that I did. And it wasn't until I talked with the young people on staff at ING that I realized that, again, my reaction was wrong. and that I should have listened to and considered what that person was saying. And I later apologized publicly to that person. And so, brothers and sisters, what I'm trying to say is this, that anti-racism work is a work in progress. And we must be very humble about that. I don't think one ever arrives at being completely anti-racist, let alone complete. I don't think any that we arrive at being non-racist, let alone anti-racist, where we're working against racism. And what's important is our willingness to address racism in ourselves and our organizations if we lead one, as I do at ING. We have to have the right intentions and put in the sincere effort and time to learn how to be a non-racist and an anti-racist, and basically be humble and open-minded when our racism is pointed out to us. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it must be done for the sake of our children and the Muslim American community. It requires a lot of deprogramming of the racism we've all ingested living in America, and in my case, also living in the Middle East. So it isn't just the United States that's a problem. So now let's go ahead and turn to our guest speakers who will offer some insight on how to be anti-racist. I wanted to know if Imam Zaid was on with us or not. If somebody can tell me.
He is not.
He's not on yet. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin with Dr. Jamila Karim. We're very happy to have her on with us because she just left another session to join ours, and I really appreciate that. For those of you who don't know her, Dr. Jamila Karim is a former professor of religion at Spelman College. She's also an author, speaker, and blogger with specialties in Islam and Muslims in the United States and in Islamic feminism. So, Dr. Jamila, what is your take on all of this?
Thank you, Maha. First, I'd like to thank you for your sharing your vulnerability. You're modeling some of what I'm going to talk about. So right after 9/11, I was a PhD student out in the research field in both Atlanta and Chicago, researching African American and Desi or South Asian Muslim communities. And I was interviewing mostly women of both groups to understand how they saw Muslims internalizing and perpetuating racism. And I published this book, American Muslim Women, Negotiating Race, Class, and Gender Within the Ummah, to present my findings. And in my conclusion, I offered insights on how we can come together and be the beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King envisioned, a community of love and justice. So I am going to spend most of my time reading the last 2 pages of my conclusion. In a study of relations between immigrants and native-born Americans in Miami, the authors found that newcomers and Americans successfully come together when, 1, each accorded the other equal status and fair treatment, rather than one waiting for the other to change. 2, both shared a sincere interest in some goal, rather than engaging in interaction because someone said they should. And 3, cooperation across groups was required to achieve the goal. The first condition, that each accorded the other equal status and fair treatment, restates the Quranic ideal of ta'aruf, that people come to know one another with respect. By upholding Quranic ideals of social justice in a common American context, which is civic engagement, American Muslims are positioned to meet the second condition, working toward a common goal. Worshipping in the mosque is another common activity that brings Muslims together. That is, when there is a deliberate choice to attend a mosque in a different ethnic space. And of course, the common interest in changing the image of Islam and Muslims in popular culture often requires collaboration among different ethnic Muslims. Finally, the third condition, that all groups commit to understanding and cooperating with one another, is met once again in the Ta'aruf ideal in that it requires a mutual understanding of one another. To these, I would add the Quranic concept of ihsan as an essential component of changing race relations in the American Ummah or American Muslim community. English words commonly used to convey the meaning of this esteemed Quranic quality are excellence, goodness, and beauty. As stated earlier, the Quran commands both adl, or justice, and ihsan in our relations with others. What is the relationship between these two terms mentioned side by side in the Quran? According to Arabic lexicologists, excellence or beauty, ihsan, surpasses justice because ihsan means giving more than one owes and taking less than is owed to one, whereas adl or justice means giving what one owes and taking what is owed to one. In other words, Muslims' pursuit of justice should have an aesthetic. Incorporating ihsan in our goal of improving intra-ummah race relations means applying forgiveness, mercy, and preference to others in the face of injustice. Correcting a wrong, in this case racism, must not be compromised, but it requires that the wronged person forgive, make excuses for, and look for the good in the one who has committed the wrong. As one community activist in Chicago suggested, Muslims need to practice more the Islamic principle of husn adhan, which means giving, or good opinion, which means giving a fellow Muslim the benefit of the doubt. Here, husn comes from the Arabic word, or the same Arabic root as ihsan. About privileged immigrants, the activists notice there are people who do things in secret, i.e., anonymously giving money and resources to inner city communities and families that we don't know about. Instead of cynicism, an attempt by African Americans to see the sincerity and good effort of immigrants will help ease tensions between these groups. For a South Asian Muslim, acting with ihsan might mean humbly modifying her behavior if she has been told that she has somehow offended an African American, even though she does not intuitively see her actions as harmful or prejudiced. She might make an effort to acknowledge that in many American Muslim spaces, her status as a South Asian Muslim does in fact grant her privileges, ones that sometimes may alienate African Americans occupying the same space. To apply ihsan does not mean that we ignore an injustice or allow it to go unchecked. Rather, it means creating beautiful relations between people built on mercy and trust, so that as we confront sensitive issues of power and privilege in our communities, we are more likely to listen to one another, care about our future together, and work with one another for change. Reading this passage after all these years, I realized that this vision of a community of love and justice, but the love outweighing the justice, is the concept of radical love that I have been exploring lately. I define radical love as mind dazzling love that pours out of loss. After all, we would not be here if not for George Floyd and the countless loss of Black lives. Radical love is, in the midst of hardship, heartbreak, profound loss, hunger, or poverty, in the midst of any of that, moving in a way where your only concern is Allah seeing you, because it is only Allah's love that you desire. We cannot be the beloved community unless our hearts are totally for Allah. because the character traits required, forgiveness, mercy, justice, generosity, patience, courage, they cannot be achieved unless our aspiration is God. We cannot fight systemic racism unless our aspiration is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because so often we will have to do work that is only seen by Allah, recognized by Allah, and lifted by Allah. And this is why the Ansar of Medina showed radical brother and sisterhood, because they had the Messenger of Allah in their midst and their eyes were on Allah. And I end on a verse referring to that time. He, or God, is the one who supported you, speaking to the Prophet, is the one who supported you with his help and with the believers and brought together their hearts. If you had spent all that is in the earth, you could not have brought their hearts together, but God brought them together. Indeed, he is exalted in might and wise. The radical love, the justice requires our efforts, but the victory is Allah's. May Allah grant us victory. Amin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamila. That was absolutely beautiful. The idea of integrating ihsan in our daily practice, that's beautiful. And I believe that Imam Zaid joined us now. Imam Zaid, you kind of missed the introduction, but you were in one of the webinars that we did in this series. Let me introduce you first. So Imam Zaid is the co-founder of Zaytuna College. He is a renowned Muslim author and speaker, and whom many of us lovingly consider to be the people's Imam. That's the title that we have given you, Imam Zaid. Imam Zaid, we just wanted to get your insight and perspective on anti-Black racism or intra-Muslim racism that exists. It's undeniable. I'm Arab. I'm telling you that it does. You know, I've seen it among Arabs. I've seen it among Asians. So we wanted to get your take on this and your thoughts on how to counter it. How do we counter internalized racism? So.
Okay, I read something slightly different. I think I interpreted the instructions I had as to talk about justice in the context of the fitra, or the human nature. So what I'm going to do briefly is read from an article I wrote on the topic, and then circle back to answer the immediate question. And I'm going to do all that in 7 minutes. Inshallah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Mursaleen, Sayyidina Muhammad, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Muslims go further than merely embracing religion as a private concern. They argue that religion, while being subjectively affirmed by individual humans, has been instituted by God to protect 5 objective universals of Kuliyatul Khams: religion itself, life, the intellect, family, and property. Some add honor as a 6th universal. Religion, owing to its theocentric nature, might be the only universal many modern people find controversial in this set of universals. Islam, however, acknowledges a non-theocentric foundation for justice. This source is a universal human nature or innate disposition, fitra, which allows humans to agree upon certain acceptable and unacceptable actions. These actions can be known independently from revelation, which can be seen as affirming them. These twin sets of justice, revelation, and human nature are summarized in the following verse. These are the ones who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet whom they find inscribed with them in the Torah and the gospel. He commands for them what is right and ma'ruf, and forbids from them what is wrong and munkar. He makes lawful for them the wholesome at-tayyibat, and prohibits from them impurities, al-khaba'ith. He relieves them from the burden of oaths and strictures previously placed upon them. Therefore, those who believe in him, reverence him, assist him, and follow the light sent down to him, they are the ones who succeed. Most of the exegetes opine that what is right in the context of this verse is what is declared lawful by revelation, while what is wrong is what revelation declares to be unlawful. This is the first foundation of justice emphasized by Imam Shafi'i and others. Many exegetes posit that the wholesome and impure, which are mentioned subsequently in the verse, comprise respectively those things human nature finds agreeable, good, and pleasurable, and those things it finds repulsive, bad, and despicable. Human nature, therefore, is the second moral foundation of justice for Muslims. The renowned theologian and exegete Fakhruddin al-Razi comments on the wholesome and impurities after rejecting an interpretation that would render them synonymous with what is right and what is wrong mentioned in the verse. He says, rather, it is necessary to interpret what is intended as by at-tayyibat as agreeable, beneficial things according to human nature. This is because engaging in them brings delight, which is a benefit, and the ruling in beneficial things is lawfulness. This verse indicates that the ruling in everything the soul finds agreeable and good, and human nature finds delightful, is lawfulness, unless there's a detailed countervailing proof. Anything the soul finds vile and human nature finds filthy, engaging in it is a source of pain, which involves harm, and the ruling for harmful things is unlawfulness. From this, we can understand that there are two laws behind the laws, revelation and the law of human nature, or fitrah. While the former is the ultimate arbiter for Muslims, the latter by itself leads to a set of universally recognized and morally acceptable actions. The universality of these actions is rooted in the innate disposition humans have been fashioned upon. We read in the Quran, orient your face towards religion in accord with your innate disposition. This is the nature of fitrah, of God, upon which he has fashioned humanity. Let there be no alteration in the creation of God. That is the upright religion. However, most people realize it not. Muslims view fitrah as a disposition shared with all human beings, moving it beyond immediate religious considerations. If we accept this, we accept that certain universally accessible and widely understandable actions, such as compassion for infants and the defense of the helpless, can rightfully serve as the source of a social order wherein people may differ religiously, even philosophically, while possessing sufficient shared values to allow for the formation of a viable political community. That community is grounded in a common sense of justice that keeps its members loyal to the polity and committed to its perpetuity. So I'll stop there. So the point is this. The point is, as Muslims religiously, we have many injunctions contained in Revelation that push us to be just and equitable. And also as human beings in an unadulterated state, there are many natural propensities that push us to support and affirm standards that are just. Therefore, we have no excuse not to be totally committed to just relations between all members of our society, particularly those who have been historically oppressed, in the case of the African American community, and virtually the entire people enslaved, and then quasi-liberated, but in a de jure state, or de facto state rather, and continuing in slavery through Jim Crow, and still struggling to overcome the vestiges of formal slavery and the vestiges of Jim Crow as they manifest themselves in the new Jim Crow and other measures. So we as Muslims who are building our affair on these twin foundations, we have no excuse, no matter where we hail from, no matter what our national origin might be, in this country, not to find ourselves on the side of those who have been historically oppressed, on the side of those who have been dehumanized and commodified, on the side of those who have consistently encountered barrier after barrier for full inclusion into our society. And those who would argue otherwise would have a difficult time explaining discrimination in housing, discrimination in small business loan grants, discrimination in the implementation of New Deal, privileges from the GI Bill, whose privileges were denied African American veterans after the Second World War. From home ownership, the greatest vehicle for wealth accumulation in 20th century American society, for incarceration rates, arrest rates, disproportionate killings at the hands of law enforcement, and many other indicators of an unjust, unfair system. So we have no excuse as Muslims, because if we were to argue the religion isn't clear about it, then we would have to make an argument also against human nature. And so making those twin arguments would be extremely difficult. So may Allah bless us to be true to ourselves as human beings, and to be true to ourselves as Muslims who follow the unlettered prophet, who build our affair on the basis of the Quran. We have no excuse. So may Allah reward this effort, and alhamdulillah, it's really, to me, it's a very good thing that it's a series that is going on over a period of time, and not just a knee-jerk response to things happening in the news cycle, such as the aforementioned killing of Mr. Floyd, which deserves a response. But many people who responded, as long as it was in the news cycle, have moved on as the news cycle moved on. But alhamdulillah, ING and those participating in this effort have not moved on, keeping it fresh in the consciousness of the people. And so may Allah give us tawfiq, and may Allah bless us, as we said, to live up to the ideals we hold as Muslims, and to live up to the ideal embedded in us by our Lord and our fitra, or in our human nature. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.
Jazakallah khair, Imam Zaid. Hopefully you and Dr. Jamila will be able to stay for the discussion, for the roundtable discussion that we're going to have later. I'm going to now go to Imam Faheem Schweib. Imam Faheem Schweib is was a former board member at ING for about 10 years. He is the resident Imam of Masjid Warithin in Oakland for 36 years. Imam Faheem, if you could just share with us your advice or wisdom or insight on how people could be anti-racist in our community.
Unmuting myself. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, again, along with others, I join in saying honored to be a part of this series and part of this project, part of this work. Alhamdulillah, it is so vast. I decided to just do something pretty simple and formulaic. One is the Quran tells us that everyone acts according to their own disposition, and Allah knows who it is that's best guided on the way. And that, for reference sake, is 17th chapter and the 84th verse of the Quran. Many years ago, in processing that verse, I resolved on 5 points of movement, and I lettered them EVEDA, where the verse says, Ela shakilati, that is, everyone acts according to their shakila. And this shakila is translated as disposition, but I also find it to also carry the meaning socialization. Everybody acts according to the way that they've been socialized. So when we talk about the human nature, when we talk about the Quran, then the Quran is revealing to us how that nature actually operates. And so now we know that the debate between nurture and nature has been resolved upon the fact that it is not either or, it is both. So there is this nature-nurture relationship to the way that human beings act. And even in the word, phonetically, you can hear the sound of shackle in the consonants for the word shakila, shackled. And that's what we get shackled to. We get shackled to our socialization. And that socialization, 90% of our personality is formed by the time we're 10 years old. And 60 or 70% of that is formed by the time we're 6 years old. And this period of time from 0 to 6 is called or said to be that we as human beings were in what you call a hypnagogic state. We think that they're alive and conscious and aware of everything that's going on. No, the child is just downloading what's going on in their environment. I saw a comedic, it was presented as comedy, but often as comedy does, it's a genius way of satirically pointing out these are the facts. A little Caucasian girl, maybe about 3 years old, she had eaten cake that she shouldn't have eaten. And then when mommy recording this conversation is asking her what happened to the cake, goes, yeah, somebody came in and ate the cake. They stole the cake. And then after a few seconds of pause, the baby says, and it was a black man, right? This baby is 3 years old, just learning to speak. And she is ascribing the wrong that she did to a black man. I wonder where she learned that at 3. Well, the fact is that we are in an environment, a culture that socializes people along the lines of what we've been calling, well, racism plays the role, but I accept that it's a caste system. Everything that was described in terms of various indicators, these are the things that happen in a caste system to people who are low caste. But in relationship to this, this personality formation, the socialization and the acculturation that has happened inside of this environment, whose object is to keep those at the bottom on the bottom and to exploit them to the fullest, in the fullest possible manner. This shakila, this socialization, we, all of us, and the people in the world, and the dominance and the hegemony that that quote unquote white supremacy, I use that in big air quotes, that white supremacy has spread all over the world. And those people who are from other parts of the world, they are not free from having been influenced, indeed internalizing and accepting and embracing the very values that we're going to that they would need to apply in order to be successful in America, because the system is there, whether you know it or not, accept it or not, conscious or not, it is there. So the socialization process didn't only happen in America, the same process was socializing there. So when people come over here from parts otherwise in the world, they bring with them those internalized values that they have also absorbed through the masterful influence of propaganda around the world and the nature of American presence. So when you look at the way that people act, and they act according to socialization, that socialization itself being fundamentally undergirded or infused with what we call racism, then it should be understood that nobody is free from having been affected by it, those on the top and those on the bottom, as well as those in the middle, which frankly, many of our immigrant brothers and sisters can be put into that middle range. We're not really on the top, we're not really on the bottom. And so oftentimes they in order to progress in this environment, in this American society, they often have to demonstrate and embrace values that say, well, I'm not one of them, I'm with you. So it's like this class association, this class affiliation, and this class ascription, whether these quote unquote blacks or Muslims or not, the point is that they are low caste. The point is that they are not upper class. So the mixture of racism and classism also goes along with this Muslim mix. So there are three other letters. I've talked about the socialization. Everyone acts according to their socialization, so there's behavior. Where does the behavior come from? It comes from the socialization. Okay, where does the socialization come from? The socialization comes from the emotional set of that individual. Once the individual, there's a certain emotional disposition, a certain emotional Well, I mean, I'm sorry, I got to give you the definition so that the connection can be clearer. Emotion is an affective disturbance that originates in a person's psychological situation. That is, the person likes or does not like something because of their psychological situation. Then that psychological situation sets up in the person as a disposition. So when you see them, you're seeing their disposition, but their disposition is only a reflection of their emotional set as it relates to whatever it is they're looking at. So if they're looking at the Caucasian, then there's an emotional response to the Caucasian. If they're looking at a quote unquote African-American, then there's going to be emotional response there. So everyone has that emotional set that gives them that disposition, and then the behavior follows. So where does the emotional set come from? It comes from their value system. It comes from their value system, which again has everything to do with how do I get the best out of the world or the society or the place that I find myself in? How do I have to be in order to do that? What are obstacles to my progress, and what are advantages, or what will assist me in making progress? That's how I value things. So if I look at a Caucasian and I see Caucasian as something that would afford me a benefit, and I look at Blacks and I don't see Blacks as affording me a benefit, then I'm going to have a positive orientation and attitude and valuing for the Caucasian, and I'm going to have a derogatory or a negative valuing for the Black person. And that's how it's going to be seen in this system, because that's the structure of the system. The whites are the good ones and the Blacks are the bad ones. And we don't have to go through all the cultural artifacts that reinforce that point. But the point is that that's what gets absorbed. So that becomes the value system of the individual. Where does the value system of the individual come from? It comes from the way that they from their experiences, comes from their environment, comes from their education, which also is pervasive, but and also saturated with that caste racism-based system, so that in the educational process, in the educational institutions, all the institutions, they are painted, saturated, and resting upon. They're instantiated by the very values that flow fully down that causal pathway that I'm talking about, that ends in action. So believe it or not, this is the concluding part of my comment. So if we want to change the back end is behavior. We want people to act differently towards Blacks. Okay, we talk about anti-Black racism, and conversation going to continue on that. But there's the action. Okay, you want to change the action. Okay, you want to change the action, you have to change the disposition. You want to change the disposition, you have to change the emotional set. You want to change the emotional set, you have to change the value system. You want to change the value system, you have to change the educational system. You have to change the experience. You have to change that's in the environment that reinforces the behavior that people in acting the way that they do believe is the best way to act. So people act the way they act because they think that's the right way and the best way to act. And so I say that in the system such as it is, with white on the top and Black on the bottom and the other people in between, they want to get as far away from the Black as they can by whatever means, and get as close to the white as they possibly can. And unless a person is conscious of that particular dynamic in their effort to move up the scale in the society, that's precisely what they're going to do and what they're going to continue to do. It has to be a conscious act to do otherwise. But that consciousness has to come on the front end: education, experience, environment. You have to get out of your circle and get into the other person's circle, develop what that another E could be: empathy. We have to develop more empathy for the other, but you have to get out of that old space, come into a new space, new education, and then you can see things differently. I'm going to put a comma on the end of it, but I'll end my comment there.
MashaAllah. Thank you so much, Imam Faheem. You're absolutely right in the way that people think about these issues. They see a benefit in associating with certain groups over others, and that's how they make their decisions on how to engage with people. I'm sure we're gonna come back to that, but I want to just continue down the list here. The person after is Dr. Mansa Bilal King. If you could also come on, Dr. Bilal. Dr. Bilal is the Senior Diversity Consultant at Yardstick Management and Associate Professor at Morehouse College for 13 years. He's an old friend of ING, and he's also been a consultant for us for many years. So Dr. Bilal, your take on this issue.
Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. Thank you, Maha. I want to thank everybody for taking some time out of their busy schedules and lives. I will disappear briefly after this. We on the East Coast, Maghrib basically came in when the program started, and so I have to sneak off and pray. But before I do that, I just want to share these words, and I'll come back after so that I think Imam Schweib, as always, he gives the sociology, and so I don't have to, and I appreciate that. I'll be brief on the sociology, and I'll just kind of share some of my Islamic contemplation. I have spent a bit of time working on these issues. That is to say, I've been thinking about this stuff since I was 12 years old, maybe 5 if you count when I started protesting the Pledge of Allegiance. And, after all these years of observing human beings, doing very much what Imam was describing, very much what Maha was affirming. And we're talking here about not just, the census, the US Census instructions will tell you if you're from North Africa to check white, right? So we're not just talking about folks from North Africa though. My wife is a Ghanaian, and we have these conversations all the time with fellow Africans who come from south of the desert or, to the east on the continent. And, I have these conversations all the time with folks from the Caribbean. And there's a general tendency. It's not a universal, it's not deterministic, but there's definitely a general tendency for people who don't have the longer roots in the country, right? If you came after the 1965 Immigration Act changes, or I should say if your family came in that period, which we're still in, oftentimes, you just don't have the benefit of being forced to have reckoned with what has been done here. It's not so much what has happened here, but what has been done. The early early Muslim immigrants to this country from places like South Asia, East Africa, are noted for their mingling with, indigenous disadvantaged peoples, partly because they arrived during the time when they were also forced by whites to be associated with disadvantaged peoples. Also because they were not as distant from us in terms of class as often, right? Education and wealth. But people who've come more recently have come to an America where they can enjoy a different set of opportunities. And Islamically, what that means is those are Muslims who are in a position of needing to be grateful. This is about shukr, right? To whom should folks be grateful? Definitely to Allah, right? Many people count their blessings. The majority of their family might be living somewhere back, quote unquote, back home where, the conveniences of America are not so bountiful. Although right now, since COVID started, I think a lot of folks are recognizing, there's a price to pay. But overall, up until the past, till March, people were really willing to look over a lot of the flaws in this society. And some of that has to do with not having to live in the, neck deep in those flaws, but rather, living on the benefits that come to some while others have to endure the flaws to a magnified degree. Those others, in historical perspective, have a tendency to be the people who bled, whose fathers, mothers, grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, uncles, ancestors in general bled for the doors to be opened. Those doors that opened in 1965, they didn't open out of the largesse of America's white people. They opened because my ancestors and other people's ancestors who often look a lot like me, but not exclusively Black, fought. And there was a price that we paid. There's a price that literally my generation, young folks beneath me, are paying because our ancestors fought. Um, Someone like Imam Jamillah Al-Amin is in prison now. That's part of the price that our community has had to pay. The police violence that you are seeing on your television screen that has gone on for generations and just wasn't, excuse me, your television and social media screen, right? It wasn't recorded often enough for it to flood the airwaves. Many white Americans were shocked in the 1950s and 60s when the civil rights leaders very strategically chose, Bull Connor in Alabama, because they knew that he was going to display on camera what some more sophisticated Southern whites knew better than to display. These kinds of things were strategic, and people paid the price. Martin Luther King Jr. paid with his life. So folks who are here enjoying America's opportunities, if your choice is to enjoy those opportunities while looking down your nose at the communities whose very state is a result of the fight that we have had to fight, that our ancestors had to fight. My generation, our fight was a different fight. We came after our ancestors bled, but there's still a fight going on. If you come here and have no gratitude for what our ancestors have bled to do, literally, America is a democracy to the extent that it is now because our ancestors bled. Going all the way back to its founding as a faux democracy or a casted democracy, and only the upper caste had meritocracy and democracy. Those were the elite landed whites, the white gentry, as we often call them. And even among them, only the males. That was America's beginning, and it was proclaiming itself a democracy even then. But we fought, and we forced it to open. Native American, indigenous people to this land fought, and we're still fighting, and they're still fighting. The primarily Mexican American, but many Latinidad ethnic groups that come from countries that have had the U.S. government destabilize their society, right? But primarily the Mexican American brothers and sisters fought, right? Look up Hugo Chavez, just to tip of the iceberg, right? On this land, to make this place a democracy to some extent, to an extent that you can look at least on the documents on paper, and you can look at the lives of people who've come here voluntarily and see them taking advantage of democracy and meritocracy. It wasn't free. You didn't earn it. America didn't colonize you. I mean, it messed with your country at some point. Listen, I'm Persian coup in 1952, and the list goes on and on and on. But you weren't here opening this place up for people to come in and be able to look down their noses at us as we struggle with the consequences of fighting. And believe me, it's not simply that Black folks are trifling. Of course, there are some trifling Black folks. There are some trifling people in every group. But because so many of my people refused to accept the second-class citizenship and stood up, we got, just think of the military analogy, and I'll end on this. When you go to war, the first platoon or squadron that has to go and face the enemy, those are the ones who get decimated. But their sacrifice often is what enables those who come later, right, to take advantage of an opening and win. You don't dishonor those fallen soldiers. You honor them to the highest degree, and you don't treat their families poorly. You treat their families well for the rest of their lives. And so this is the challenge that I put out to those who were not here and did not fight and did not bleed in this land for the opportunities that are available here. Learn gratitude, and you cannot learn the gratitude if you don't know the struggle. So you have to study the struggle, and you will not understand the struggle if you do not understand a lot of other aspects. And so you have much work to do. And this is not a sweeping generalization. I've met my fair share of young Arab and Desi and older Arab and Desi and Indonesian, even people who have come here and have a level of respect, right, and a level of appreciation. But there's still challenges, because if you insist on segregating yourself somewhere with white people trying to get into the honorary white box, you've still got work to do. If you insist on keeping your children out of schools with our children, you've still got work to do. If you insist on treating our children like guests when we attend Islamic schools that you've opened, you've still got work to do. And so on that note, I will close out, but I believe in the best of humanity and what we can do. So I hold out hope, and I continue to offer these words and in dua. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Amin. Thank you.
Very powerful, Dr. Bilal, and you're absolutely right. I had asked all of you not to soft pedal this conversation, and you certainly didn't do that. And I think that what you said is right on. And this is why it's so important to learn the history, the civil rights history in the United States, and our own history that begins with the enslaved African Muslims. So much work to do. Next on our list, and we're going through this quickly before we have the conversation, but I just want to introduce everyone that's actually been on all of the series. So let's go ahead and go to Imam Abu Khadir Al-Amin. Imam Abu Khadir Al-Amin is also a friend of the organization. I've known him for maybe the longest, maybe 30 years. He is the resident Imam of the San Francisco Muslim Community Center for the last 30 years. And he's someone who also performed my marriage to my husband, which happened 25 years ago. So very happy to have you, Imam Abu Khadir. If you could just share with us your insight, feedback on how we can overcome anti-Black racism in the community.
Assalamu alaikum. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I seek refuge with Allah against Satan, the rejected, with Allah's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. As the previous speakers, I'm honored, consider it a privilege to be on this discussion. I hope that what I've prepared to discuss can be of benefit. And I'm appreciative of Maha for her having the courage to initiate this kind of conversation in the public forum. And I'm gonna approach it similar to the previous speakers before me, but I wanna begin reading from a publication by Imam W.D. Muhammad. It's on racism, religion, and reconciliation. And this is from the back cover of the book. Language has served racism in the world, especially in America. And that is just where the biggest creation of racism is, right here in America. The language has served to make white people feel that they are different, special, and superior. But it has also hurt them because that position is artificial. That is not true. That is not reality. So it has made white people artificial people. They have an artificial reality to deal with, and then it made their subjects also artificial. So that's where I want to begin the conversation. As Muslims, I think we have to make serious effort to make our lives and our demonstration and our practice agree with the lofty ideas we find in the Quran and in the life of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Because we know we live in a world where white supremacy has affected all of the people of the earth. It's not a phenomenon that only took place here, that African Americans experienced during slavery and post-slavery and through the Jim Crow period and even to today. But we still live in a society that's influenced by that. the United States government, it holds high ideals in terms of justice and freedom and equal protection under the law and all of these noble ideas on paper. But in the lives of the people who are asked to carry out these lofty principles, many of them fall short. Thus, we see so many instances where African American people are treated in the most inhumane ways by law enforcement and are murdered and killed. And that's part of what has stimulated this discussion. But we also have Muslims who say that Islam is a colorblind religion. Islam doesn't see colors. And that's also not actually a factual statement. It's, I think, something that's held up by people when they don't want to face perhaps their own biases or their own shortcomings when it comes to how they interact with other human beings. And we also live in a very oppressive word environment. I don't want to complicate this idea, but many of us use the language of fair skin and good hair and bad hair. These ideas are rooted in racist ideology. And we carry this on, and it's just a normal part of our language, and we're perpetuating a false idea. I believe it's equally problematic when we say people of color versus the other, which we're saying white people and everybody else is people of color. And that also is an unscientific position that people take that helps us to perpetuate other falsehoods. Because if we say that white people are different than people of color, we're putting them on the scale versus everybody else as though that's a balance, and it's not. It's actually a falsehood. It's perpetuating a false sense of comparison. It's a false comparison. When white people have as many colors as the rest of us, they have black hair, blonde hair, brown hair, yellow hair, red hair. They have a variation in eye colors. They have variations in the pigmentation of their skin. So we also help to perpetuate this idea. And then when Muslims don't want to identify with people of color because of the inherent racism that has come to them as a result of their colonization and their identification with the dominant force in the culture, which happened to be white people, we also have to understand that came as a result of religious indoctrination. Imam W.D. Muhammad taught us early on that white supremacy utilized the image of a white savior to dominate the darker people of the world with this ideology of a white savior on the cross. And the scheme was to gain political and material dominance over the darker people of the world. And they've done that. And they continue to spread this idea that God is a man. And Muslims, we have in our book, the Holy Quran, we're told that we should warn those who say that God has a son. This idea gives people a sense of arrogance, and then when they act out of that arrogance, we have the kind of problems that we are facing in the society today. I would like to pause here and read from this same book, with Allah's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer, out of respect for man's creator, a message of concern by Imam W.D. Muhammad. What would happen if people would sit in churches throughout the world for centuries with the image of an African-American man as the savior of the world before them? What would this do to the minds of the world's children? What would happen to the world's children put under a figure of a particular race presented pitiable and in pain, the savior of all men? Quran chapter 3, verse 64. Say, O people of the book, come to common terms as between us and you. that we worship none but Allah, that we associate no partners with him, that we erect not from among ourselves lords and patrons other than Allah. If then they turn back, say you, bear witness that we at least are Muslims, bowing to Allah's will. Civilized nations should want their religion be also civilized. False worship is the worst form of oppression. We are no gods, we are only men, mortals from mortals he Allah created. So it's important for us to address that, because the influence of that false idea has caused some people to try to set themselves up as lords over others. The African-American community, Muslim community under Imam Deputy Muhammad's leadership, we made a strong commitment not to allow others to set themselves up as lords over us. Many people question our validity as Muslims. They even question us as who was your sheikh and who was your imam sheikh, and they leave Allah out of the equation. Allah blesses whom he pleases. And we are grateful that Allah blessed us to come to value and appreciate the Quran, the life of Muhammad, our prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the responsibility he placed on us to establish our Muslim life here in America. We're not content to just talk about the beautiful features of Islam, how Islam is for fairness, Islam is for justice, Islam is for kindness, Islam is a religion of love, Islam is a religion of generosity. All of those ideas sound good and well, but what we need to see those in practice. We need to see those in operation. We don't need to hear about all of the beautiful features on an automobile while it's parked in the driveway. We need to get in the vehicle that Allah has given us and let's drive it to our destiny. Our destiny is to establish a model Muslim community, similar to the one that was established under Muhammad, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in Medina. And part of our work, the Muslim community in America, part of our work was learning how to civilize ourselves because we had been treated as less than human, less than what God intended, how we should be treated by other human beings. So we had to go through a painful period of just getting ourselves in the right condition for education, for business, for cultural life, for social life, for establishing community life. And we're still in that process. And we're going to do this job whether we have friends and allies or not, because we're going to be held accountable by our Lord, who has given us this religion to establish the model Muslim community life in America. And we accept that challenge. And we're going to need friends and allies. However, if we have to do it by ourselves, it's okay. We're not begging people to help us or assist us, though it would be a blessing if we did have more allies, especially from those who say they believe like we believe. But we've experienced discrimination when we were in the faith of what was called Christianity. Though they said Christianity was a religion that was for all people, the most segregated place in America was the Christian churches. 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, those were the most segregated gatherings in America. There was a church for the whites and there was a church for the blacks. And it almost seems as though that kind of parallel exists within the Muslim community. There's the Muslim community of immigrants, and then there's the indigenous community of African Americans. And this is not a universal position. There are some interaction, there's some cooperation, there are some friendships, but it's not enough. And part of why we're talking about this is because I'm sure that others are aware of the discrepancies that exist. And we're not through with the work that we have to do to establish the life we want for ourselves and for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and for the future of Islam in this part of the world. We have a great deal of work to do. And part of it is we have come to be comfortable with our book, the Quran. We love it. We are establishing our life based upon it. And most of our teachers have been people who came from the same circumstances as we have. Some of our students have had the good fortune of going abroad and studying in different parts of the Muslim world. And some of them have to go through a debriefing when they come back home, because some come home and are no more of any benefit to themselves or their families when they come back from being experimented on in different cultures. So we have many challenges in terms of when you go to school. Sometimes when your children go off to universities and colleges, they might encounter some experiences that affect their life from then on. So we have to be protective of our future, and we're doing our best. This is a very serious discussion. I don't want to point the finger of blame on anyone, because I think all of us have some blameworthy characteristics that we're trying to make improvements upon. And we want Allah to bless our work. And we hope that we're approaching this with sincerity. And we hope that we can bring about some changes in the language, the way people see each other. We want to present a picture of ourselves to the world that the world can respect. And the Quran has stood us up and made us respectable. The example of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has given us the confidence to lead ourselves, and we're going to continue in that vein. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you so much, Imam Abu Khadir. The most beautiful reminder is of God's omnipotence, who chooses whom he wills to be his friends and believers. And I think that you've made that argument beautifully today, and it's something that we need to be reminded of. Next is Imam Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali is a chaplain at Bucknell University, and he's also the co-director of a mentoring program for underrepresented students at that university. Imam Muhammad, if you could please share your wisdom with us.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين وأصحابه الغر الميامين. Alhamdulillah, thank you for having me as part of this esteemed group. I feel blessed to be, counted among you and being given the opportunity to share some perspectives. One of the things that continues to come to mind as each of us have spoken on this idea of being anti-racist is how much of this message and all of the steps and all of the call to action that we have spoken of throughout this series, how all of this is so firmly rooted in the Quranic message, in the spiritual lifestyle of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Quran gives us this idea consistently, this idea of taqwa, which in the most simple meaning, taqwa means consciousness or awareness. And it's something that we have to carry through to every aspect of our life. It's a spiritual mandate that, along with many other facets of human life and interaction that sometimes we neglect, this often gets neglected in the midst of culture and ritual, and essentially often sort of capitalistic organizations with a Muslim cherry on top. That it gets sort of washed away as the central theme of this religion is to develop taqwa. And that's so this idea of being aware of oneself, being aware of Allah, right? The Quran presents primarily three types, I should say, of knowledge, of ma'rifah. And this is what the Islamic mystics have discussed. This is what the Sufi teachers have discussed. This is what the great teachers of African American Muslims in the United States have discussed. And so you have this idea of ma'rifatullah, knowing Allah, this deep knowledge of Allah, which we all know about that, or at least we'd like to believe we know about that. We understand that. But the Quran also brings, as Dr. Jamila mentions, this idea of ta'arafu, that we have been made into these different tribes, nations, male and female, that we can develop ma'rifah of one another. And then there is this ma'rifah of oneself. And the Quran addresses this in so many different ways. This idea of tazkiyah, of digging in oneself and sort of purifying oneself. And so when we're talking about this anti-racism, we're talking about thinking about the ways we are interacting within our culture. What things is our culture pushing us toward? All of this is being addressed in the Quran. So my point is to part of the call to action, which I want to speak of, is bringing ourselves to this book of the Quran that we have and bringing it to life again in these moments, in every moment going forward, right? The miracle of I'd say the African American community, including the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, including Imam Warati Muhammad, was to take this Quran and apply it socially and culturally to the lives of people. And I think in many ways we start to lose that when we only see this Quran through the lens of, quite frankly, scholars who lived 700, 800, 900 years ago. And if someone wants to come and understand the Quran, interpret the Quran, everyone reads what they wrote, which is good. But how do you read it through the lens of what's happening right in front of us? One of the brothers mentioned this idea of being what Dr. Sherman Jackson calls this aspiration towards whiteness, right? Where you come into society, whites at the top, blacks at the bottom, you're in the middle, so you naturally distance yourself from those people and aspire to be like those people who have dominated, who have colonized, and so on and so forth, taking their value. But the Quran addresses this. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا تركنوا إلى الذين ظلموا فتمسكم النار وما لكم من دون الله من أولياء ثم لا تنصرون. That don't allow your hearts to become sort of lean towards the people, the oppressors, those who have been oppressing others, lest you be touched with the fire and you have no protector, no guardian other than Allah, and no one else will help you. And so this idea we have within this whole idea of, upward mobility, and this idea of looking who's on top and sort of acculturating yourself to their values. Another thing that the Quran addresses, and what the teaching of the Prophet addresses, this idea of hubb dunya, this love of the world, this worldliness that is sort of baked into our psychology and baked into literally capitalist society, where sometimes it's not directly related to being racist. And this is why people respond very or get offended very easily with the idea of being racist, because most people are not intentionally racist. But most people are intentionally aspiring towards ideas of prosperity and success and upward mobility, which in the American context is tied to race. There's no escaping that. And if we haven't sort of laid the foundation for us to be able to see that up until now, you know, we have to a lot of work to do, you know, to go over that again, and not enough time at this moment. And so when we're given that charge of being racist or promoting racist ideas or falling into the trap of racialized ideas, the sort of sensitivity that comes with that is also born out of a disposition that the Quran has continuously tries to address. Right? One of the things that I like to mention a lot to people and to students and you know, people who I work with in multi-faith settings, intra-faith settings especially, is the way in which Allah makes us as Muslims, at least in every sort of unit of prayer that we do, we have to say, Ihdina sirata mustaqim. Oh Allah, guide us on the straight path. This is a consistent Quranic call to us as human beings to never get complacent, to never think that we have already arrived. And when we incorporate this disposition in our life, we can hear criticism. We can hear someone say, oh, what you're doing is not right. What you're doing is insensitive. What you're saying is insensitive. The Quran tells us, "La tuzakku anfusakum." Don't sanctify yourself. Huwa a'lamu biman ittaqa. Allah is the one who knows who is sanctified. Right? We are in that place of, oh Allah, guide us on the straight path. We're always in that place, and we should always be in that place. And so, if we want to overcome these you know, spiritual diseases, we have to remain in that place. And so when we hear those things that make us uncomfortable, we have to be ready to take on those things. And also understand that it's not new. I you know, often see people, you know, post things like Islam ended racism and these types of things. And I always respond, I've said, no, Islam didn't end racism. Racism is a human disease. Islam offered the solution, and it's up to human beings to end racism. This was something the Prophet faced in his own community. This is something the community faced after the death of the Prophet. This is something that even, you know, in the Muslim world, the Abbasids were able to come to power because they were able to mobilize people against this idea of sort of Arab supremacy. So they were able to get support from the Persians and the North Africans and so on and so forth to overthrow the Umayyads, because the Umayyads were, you know, you could say Arab supremacists in a sense, right? Along with the idea, of course, the family of the Prophet was the other, you know, main sort of catapult of this sort of revolution. So this, you know, so these things are not new. The Prophet had companions who were Black who wanted to get married, and no one would marry anyone to them. And the Prophet would have to come to the person's house and say, you know, do you not want Jannah, right? These are in our tradition, right? Yet sometimes we have this very idealistic understanding of all the people back then were all, you know, blemish free. No, this was a continuing process of purification that we as Muslims continue to have the responsibility to aspire towards the ideals of Islam. We're not there yet. So we have to be forward thinking and not thinking backwards of like the best is behind us, right? The best should be ahead of us. We should be striving for something better than what we've experienced. And it's a challenge. It's difficult. It's supposed to be difficult. And the Quran tells us it's supposed to be difficult. Does man think that he will be able to say, I believe, and not be tested? Fitna. Fatanna, I mean, it refers in Arabic as that process of, extracting the impurities from metal until you get gold, right? And which requires, in many cases, heating gold to extreme temperatures. And the Quran gives us this idea of jihad, right? Of striving against ourselves. So I want to, as all of we're talking about, and this has been my experience, having grown up learning the Quran and then studying psychology and then studying counseling and chaplaincy and so on, is that as I continue to sort of read and to learn all of these ideas about human nature, about the way human beings think, about anti-racism, about all of these different things, the Quran keeps coming up as like, wow, I didn't even see that. I didn't see that Allah is already telling us these things, that multiple years of research are needed for people to sort of make these conclusions and these ideas. And Allah gave us that. And I think in many ways that is, because sometimes our religious practice is so divorced from that spirit of self-purification and communal purification and striving, right? Religion often becomes this badge you wear to feel better than other people. Just as sometimes race is that way, race is a badge you wear to feel better than other people. Religion becomes that. And when it becomes that, it's easy to fall into racism because the faith and the spirituality is not in the right place. So in short, what I'm presenting is this idea of bringing the Quran and the message of the Prophet to life, forward thinking progressively about applying these lessons to our lives, applying it to the realities in front of us. Allah has given us all of this. Allah made Prophet Musa a black man fighting against a huge system of oppression, the most mentioned name in the Quran for a reason. It's not a coincidence. And so we should be able to start to see ourselves in these stories. And when we see ourselves in these stories, we can read these verses, we can read this book as an anti-racist manual, as an anti-oppression manual. And we'll find that Allah has put everything that we need in front of us and within us. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Imam Muhammad. That was absolutely beautiful. And it was good that we had you last because I think that you touched on a lot of the points that were made earlier, plus some. We're now going to turn our attention to 3 ING staff people and who are not Black Americans. Amina Jandari is part Indian Pakistani and white American. Ishaq is Indian, and Rahima Ramzani is part white and part Iranian or Persian, I should say. So we're going to hear from their perspective on what we need to do to counter anti-Black racism. We're going to start with you, Amina, first. And Amina is, for those of you that may not already know this, she's one of the ING founding members, and she's the content manager. Following her will be Ishaq Batan, who is the ING Bay Area director, and then we'll close with Rahima Ramzani, who's the ING program manager, and all of those people were actually involved in putting this series together And so I want to acknowledge them for that and thank them so much for their effort in making this possible. So Amina, let's go ahead and start with you.
Right. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be on all of you, and jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much for all of the beautiful knowledge and sharing. So as someone who's worked on this topic myself and found it both very distressing and fascinating, I think for many immigrants, if they are not familiar with this very dark chapter in American history, it's really important to study it, to learn about it, and to realize that it's still with us today, the transatlantic slavery and all that followed even after emancipation and up to the present. And unfortunately, without this knowledge and without this history, many immigrants who never study this, or even when they do study it, it doesn't directly impact them, may somehow assume that somehow African Americans are at fault, or that they as immigrants are somehow successful because of their own hard work. And it's also very important for immigrants and their children to realize that Muslim history, the history of Muslims in America, did not begin with the 1965 Immigration Act or even the late 19th century. And that this history, our history, actually begins with African American Muslims as far back as 500 years ago. And unfortunately, as immigrants, we often overlook this critical piece of our history and only focus on the history of immigrants, overlooking so many of the struggles and the narratives. People like Ayub ibn Sulaiman in the 18th century, Yaro Mahmud, Abdurrahman Ibrahima. These stories, which are contained in one of the first books to talk about this, called Servants of Allah by Sylviane Dayouth, but now in so many other works on this important topic, are an incentive and an inspiration, including my son is actually taking a class in college right now about history of Muslims in America. And I'm hoping that reading these narratives, reading about how these Muslims, in spite of overwhelming odds and challenges, were able to hang on to their faith, will give him a newfound pride in his Muslim American identity. It's also incumbent upon us as immigrants to give credit where credit is due. As we know, not only is our history more recent, but we are to some degree outsiders. We don't have the multi-generational experience in this country. And as has been mentioned before, we all owe our African-American brothers and sisters due for their fight for human and civil rights that continues till today. And while many of us discovered after 9/11 that maybe we're not as welcome in this country as we thought previously, we can find both inspiration as well as strategies from those who have been at this for generations and for centuries. And so all struggles, whether it's local, national, or global, are connected despite the different players. They're all the same stories. And so we can't claim to care about the plight of Muslims overseas while ignoring the grave injustice in our own backyard. And so we must turn to African-American Muslims as Muslims and others, obviously, as our leaders in this ongoing struggle for justice and equality in the United States. And we are all truly amateurs in this struggle. And then in addition to this curiosity and humility that we need to bring to learning about this history through books, through webinars, and people have made mention of those resources, we also need to reach out to our African-American Muslim brothers and sisters in our own community. When I was growing up, I lived in a very small university town, and nearly all of the Muslims I knew were immigrants. But since moving to the Bay, I've been blessed to live near a very vibrant American Muslim, African-American community in Oakland. And as it has been mentioned by so many of the speakers, the whole concept of ta'aruf, getting to know each other, is one of the reasons behind our diversity. So yes, we can choose to our particular cultural or linguistic group and, quote, unity in Islam and all the other things that people have mentioned. But this verse is actually telling us that this is upholding the very reason for God's creations of humans with their diversity. And we can really learn so much from each other if we can just make the intention and an effort. And it's really a shame that often immigrant Muslims will embrace their African-American brothers and sisters when they're famous imams or speakers or celebrities or politicians at fancy dinners or in luxury hotels, but forget about them in their own backyard. And this is not our prophetic tradition. nor should we interact with each other based on any kind of religious superiority or any other superiority, because as we know from so many hadith, it is often the one who is struggling the most, or who has doesn't have the microphone, whose relationship and standing with Allah is the greatest. And so inshallah, once our mosques reopen, we can make a greater effort to get out to different mosques, make a greater effort to have, here in the East Bay, they have what is called the Unity Eid, which is, as I know, the only Eid in the Bay Area where the food and the entertainment is free. And this is something that our African-American brothers and sisters really model, their hospitality, their organization, and just widening our concept of what unity means and joining together. And lastly, while it is painful to face our own shortcomings, as has been mentioned by Maha and others, including the fact that we all have some form of racism, the first step that we all need to do to really do the hard work of countering racism is working to end it, and recognizing that racism is really just a type of arrogance among our various types of arrogance. And rather than wasting time and effort kind of working to deny it, if we take that same time and that same effort to counter it, beginning with ourselves and then expanding it to our family, to our friends, where we are actively challenging racism when we hear it, when we see it, and putting into action the hadith that we all love to quote and the ayat that we all love to cite. So jazakumullah khair, and thank you. Salam.
Thank you so much, Amina. Ishaq?
Sure, thank you. And thank you to Maha and to Amina and to everyone on the ING staff, as well as to all of our speakers so far who have put kind of all of their time and energy into putting this whole series together. It's really amazing that we're kind of here at the end with our fifth webinar a few months later than when we started back in early July. So I just wanted to reference that, yeah, I am an Indian American Muslim. I'm a non-Black Muslim, and I really, again, appreciate the time and energy of all of the African American speakers on this entire series in terms of their time and preparation. So one thing I wanted to just express before I talk a little bit about calls to actions is that when thinking about racism, it's really important to get the framing right. And so anti-Black racism in the Muslim community is not an issue that concerns Black Muslims. It's really an issue that concerns us as non-Black Muslims, and as a result is really our problem. And because of that, it's us who needs to be at the forefront of addressing it and implementing everything that the panelists here have discussed, so that we can kind of take these things to our own communities. And so I want to call us as allies in the process, and as recognizing that this is our issue, to understand the unique access we're given to convey an anti-racist message, especially as non-Black Muslims. So on the previous webinar in our series, a few of our African-American leaders, including Imam Faheem and Imam Al-Amin, both talked about experiences relating to racism in the Bay Area. And unfortunately, they had some negative ones. The problem is even more pervasive when thinking about racist attitudes that may be expressed in passing or behind closed doors, where Black Muslims are not present. And I think about, a potential relative at a holiday dinner table, or a friend at a party who raps using the N-word. Usually, because these are close friends of ours, everything is said in good fun. We may be hesitant to engage because doing so is viewed as creating an uncomfortable situation and breaking a sense of peace that would otherwise exist. But I want to kind of make clear that the reality is that when someone pushes forward a view or an idea that is harmful to a community, that peace that we're kind of hoping to preserve is already broken. The level of comfort that should be there is already gone. The situation is already uncomfortable. Thinking about whether, if there was an African American in the room and how they would feel if they heard the comments, we need to kind of bear that in mind. And as non-African American Muslims, feel that same level of discomfort and take action against it in the spaces that we can. It's also common to write our friends off or those in our circle off by just saying, that's just, let's say, Muhammad. Muhammad always says things like that. But in reality, when we start to accept that type of behavior, we ultimately allow it to continue. And so I want to urge us all as kind of non-Black Muslims to take this information that we're hearing from our Black Muslim friends and then convey it to those who need it most, no matter how close or how far they are from us. And that can include ourselves and making sure that we ourselves internalize this information and then spreading it to our family and our friends and others. Challenging anti-Black racism has really short-term and long-term positive effects. In the short term, we help to avoid instances of putting Black Muslims in our circles in uncomfortable positions. And in the long term, we're working to slowly eradicate ourselves and our society of this spiritual disease. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ishaq. There was a lot there. And now we're going to go ahead and end with Rahima Ramzani. So Rahima, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Maha. Assalamu alaikum to our Muslim audience and greetings of peace to all. Before I begin, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Imam Zaid, Shakir, Faheem, Schweib, Khadir Al-Amin, and Muhammad Ali, and doctors Jamila Karim and Mansa Bilal King. I know with certainty that my heart is not the only one that has been moved beyond expression by your words this evening. Thank you. This is a very important conversation to have, and I am very glad the Muslim community has gotten to a point where we can openly discuss the anti-Black racism that exists in our communities. To culturally situate myself and where I am speaking from, I am half white and half Iranian, making me multi-ethnic, but I identify as white racially because of how I was socialized growing up. I come to this conversation as both a person who has a certain amount of white privilege inherited from my white ancestors, but also as the daughter of a non-white immigrant. These last months have been eye-opening for me because, like many others, I think, I didn't quite realize how distinctly I viewed the issue of anti-Black racism as a Black-white issue. There are a lot of non-Black people of color who have not been included in analyses on racism, and it is well past time that we do so in order to have an intersectional and nuanced understanding of the challenges that face us. There are plentiful resources, exercises, and dialogue guides that discuss how white folks can learn about their privilege, the active role they need to play in dismantling white supremacy, and how to identify and work through the problematic internal, social, and systematic norms whiteness perpetuates. However, there aren't nearly as many guides on how non-Black people of color can address their own anti-Blackness, which also takes into account the very real disadvantages they have faced as people of color and as Muslims living in the West. When Muslim people of color have their racism checked, they counter with very real examples of discrimination and cruelty that they have faced while trying to make a better life for themselves and their families. How have we enjoyed racial privileges, they may ask, when we are forced to change our names to find employment, to endure taunting and bullying from grade school to our professional offices, when coworkers, friends, and our neighbors sometimes support and encourage wars against lands that are home to many of our loved ones, and support legislation that prevents us from seeing them and sharing our life's beautiful moments. All this is true, but even still, it is also true that Muslim people of color experience privileges at a level up from our African American sisters and brothers. One experience does not cancel the other out. This issue requires a yes and mindset. If you have gone to this point in our webinar series, then you know how racism works in the United States. And we should all understand that anti-Black racism is widely prevalent in US American culture and always has been. We are not immune from absorbing this from the non-Muslim communities around us, and it is also a lie to think we did not have anti-Black racism in our communities back in our homelands. So what can we do? That is what we are here in today's webinar to discuss. My contribution to add to the insightful calls to action already shared by my fellow panelists is for those who wish to interrupt the racism they witness in their families, community centers, or friend gatherings. In Islam and in many ethnic cultures that Muslims come from, the kind of calling out that happens in other cultures is not considered appropriate behavior, especially if you are speaking to an elder in your family or someone who will not take direct feedback well. What I suggest instead is a more indirect approach where you make opportunities to have dialogue with individuals about anti-Black racism and educate them about the history of racism in your ethnic culture in the United States and what current African American Muslims are experiencing in our own communities. Do not wait for the topic to come up, but actively engage those within your circle of influence on these subjects. Continue to learn and address your own internalized anti-Black racism and share your learnings as time goes on. When you frame the conversation as sharing an interesting topic you are learning about and doing the work to correct your own implicit biases, your audience is much less likely to feel defensive, and you will be able to sustain these conversations over long periods of time, resulting in the transformative change we all wish to see in our communities. Inshallah.
Thank you so much, Rahima. So Ishaq, if you could put everybody back on, that would be great. If we could just have everybody appear in the on Facebook, we could then begin having a discussion among the speakers. Let me know if that's happening or not.
Everyone's on.
Everyone's on. Okay, great. So thank you again, Rahima and Ishaq and Amina. And I was going to summarize what people have said. I've been taking copious notes, but I won't do that just in the interest of time. And I'll just go ahead and open it up for a discussion among the speakers. Do any of you want to respond to remarks that have been made by any of the speakers, or want to add anything that you missed the first time?
I'll start by saying I'd like to thank all of the panelists as well as the ING personnel for really speaking in such powerful, meaningful, and enlightening ways. It's a great honor and pleasure to listen to all of you, because I've certainly benefited tremendously from the diversity of thought, the profundity of human dignity that you all conveyed, and the honesty. So may Allah Ta'ala continue to bless everyone and all of the work that you do in your various areas. And if we can help in any way, let us know. And Maha, I'd like a copy of that poet, the artwork behind you. So did you get that?
Anytime, Imam Zaid. Anytime, Imam Zaid. You know, I wanted to actually speak to Zaytuna College. It's one of the few Muslim institutions where I really feel there's tremendous amount of diversity, you know, in its staff, in both the scholars that are teaching the students, and in the employees, and in the student body as well. But that's maybe the subject of another webinar. Before we close, we're going to put up a slide that will share suggestions for other webinars that are happening, that are coming up, one by Muslim Arc and another one that Dr. Jamila Karim is involved in, that we really encourage people to attend. But any other thoughts that people have? Dr. Bilal, Imam Faheem, Imam Abu Khadir, Al-Amin. I'm going to share my notes. Imam Faheem, you need to unmute yourself. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just want to mention a couple of pieces that I say people should look into, just books. One of them is by Isabel Wilkerson, came out last month, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Another old book from a very public writer. Any other time I would have known his name. He's the one that did The Tipping Point and the rest of that.
Well, Malcolm Gladwell.
Malcolm Gladwell, thank you. And I want to particularly point to Outliers. And I'm thinking in the context of what Dr. Jamila had brought to us about that. And there's a community called Rosetto, when he explains the quad, because they were outliers in terms of their health and all the other things that were there, and they couldn't be explained by traditional measures. And bottom line is, like, they really lived in the way and upon the values that Islam calls to. That is, when you tick off all of those things, basically that was there. So I think people should see that. And also for people to look at the Robbers Cave experiment. You can find it on YouTube, the Robbers Cave experiment. And it's about what's called the contact hypothesis, which is there was presuming that his name is Muzaffar Sharif. He was a Harvard-trained psychologist that conducted it from Turkey. So he's Turkey. So I'm going to jump out there and say he was a Muslim. But when
all Turks are Muslim.
Okay. All right.
I'll tell a story when you get done.
All right, great. So as I listened to what Dr. Jamila was saying and all of the points to be made to say that in the presence of this quality, that quality, this quality, and that quality, that's how we get to where we want to go. And the whole contact hypothesis had most everything, to do with lita'arafu, getting to know one another. But so I won't go further on it, but the point is that it was deliberately structured to create conflict and then to see if that contact hypothesis could be used to reduce and eliminate the conflict. And it was done. And I believe the psychologist that was primary in that, not only the one who did the experiment, but Gordon Allport. So these are very important things, because the point is that as Imam Muhammad Ali was saying, that Allah has already revealed. Sometimes we're just not aware of it, but Allah has given us the abstractions. He's given us the quote unquote the truth, for which hypotheses spend a lot of time experimenting to come to the same conclusion if they're blessed. And so I'm saying that some of these sources are some of the places that we should look for actions that can actually be taken from a personal point of view, that will enable us in our own individual space to operate and apply some of these principles that have been revealed in the Quran and researched and supported by experimentation.
Yeah, very quickly until someone else jumps in. Imam Faheem reminded me of something. In terms of outliers, I think what the power we have when we act as Muslims, if you look at global COVID-19 statistics, the country that's done the best with the virus is New Zealand. For several months, they had 0 cases. Then they had an outbreak of 4 or 5, and they locked down Auckland to trace the context. Number 2 in the entire world is Senegal. And so that the reason it's an outlier, Senegal has 7 doctors to every 100,000 people. But they're 16 million people. They've only had 284 deaths, 14,000 cases since March. In the US, there are about 50,000 cases a day. And one of the things, there's a study, well, they didn't say Islam, but they said their culture is such that something like wearing a mask, they would never have a second thought, because their culture teaches them to prioritize others. And so if I'm going to wear a mask to prevent someone from catching if I sneeze or cough or talk too loud, I might expose people. I'm going to wear a mask unhesitatingly. And so there are other cultural realities rooted in Islam that put them in that position to be the second most effective country on earth, despite the very, lack of a better word, thin resource base. And so when we practice our religion, it empowers us to do things that some people might deem impossible. And I think people who understand Islam understand that potential. And for that reason, Arnold Toynbee, arguably the greatest historian of the 20th century, some people don't like his method, but arguably, he said that Islam can solve the race problem. And he also identified racism as a spiritual disease. And so as we approach it, I think one way we have to look at it, in addition to all of the ways that many of which were angles were discussed today is, amongst other things, as a spiritual disease amenable to a spiritual cure. And that cure lies when we elevate ourselves above what the world has made us. The world has made us racist to greater or lesser extents. And when we can rise above that because we cultivate our spirit, and our spirit is not of the stuff of the world, it's not of material stuff. That, for example, Marxism reduces us to, or atheism. We can go a long way. Allah give us tawfiq.
Jazakallah khair. Anyone else? Dr. Jamila?
Alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
So indeed, as Muslims, we have a lot of potential, and there's proof in our book, you know, as Imam Muhammad talked about, that we already have the manual. And we also have the example of our beloved Prophet. And there's also sociological proof. And I'm thinking about what Imam Faheem mentioned. I especially liked his words that we have to get out of our old space and into a new space. And that just reminded me of some of the language that I used in my book. I talked about our communities being made up of ethnic Muslim spaces. And so kind of practically, that was the way for me to talk about, you know, how you have African-American Black Muslim spaces, they see Muslim spaces, Arab spaces, or a mixture. And so a lot of what I was showing was that, you know, even though we have these divides, we also have these moments where we're crossing these ethnic Muslim spaces. And so even though they are ethnic Muslim spaces, they are all Muslim spaces. And that was the whole point, that, you know, for sociological reasons, like, you know, being at a majority white university, and there's an MSA, and so everybody, or, you know, people are going to come to the MSA because everyone's looking for that kind of socialization, and that's going to bring us together, right? Or if you're fighting Islamophobia, as I kind of, you know, referred to in my passage, that, you know, those moments are going to bring us together, or that we all wear hijab, and so we're going to notice each other, you know, on the campus. And so, so just like really thinking about those spaces, and then being deliberate about moving across them as well. And lastly, I'll just mention one that really stood out to me, and was the Iman space in Chicago, the Inner City Muslim Action Network space. And I was doing research when Iman wasn't as popular as it is today. That was, you know, 20 years ago. But what always struck me was that the way that Rami Nashashibi decided to live in the, you know, inner city. And so not only was his organization there, but, you know, he actually lived there. And so that was always a way to kind of strike conversation and think about, like, to what lengths will we actually go to, again, move out of our old spaces, to resist our privilege, to send our children to school with Black children. And a lot of people just, you know, are not willing to do that. And but it was just good to be able to engage and ask that question, and then inspire people to make those kinds of moves, even if they're not as drastic or, you know, as profound as actually living in a Black neighborhood. Though I really think that's the only way we're going to really make change. I mean, our movements and actions really have to be radical. They really do, because again, the racism is just so pervasive. So.
Thank you, Dr. Jamila. Anyone else wants to jump in and add anything before we put up the slide for what next for people?
I wanted to add just a little bit, and supporting Dr. Jamila's point of, you know, she uses the word radical, which I think is appropriate. And it's the way that we as Muslims have to think. And those who have thought that way in our history are people who transform societies. And I think there is a push, just as you find in the Quran from Pharaoh, this idea of identifying anything that does not fit with the current structure and support the current structure, that it is a threat, to people's sort of comfort and the society and mobilizing people. But it is exactly that radical thought and that radical movement, that radical love that transforms society, right? The community of the Prophet would not have worked if people weren't willing to leave their homes, live in a room with someone that they just met, right? Like share houses, split their houses in half, right? To host the Muhajirun, and a society is built through this sense of solidarity. Like, we can't think that we are going to fix problems in this country by raising money and throwing money at things. If we are going to be a truly Islamic community that's going to transform this society towards Islam, we have to have solidarity. We do have to be willing to live together, to be uncomfortable together, and grow from that point, right? So, too often we want, there was one sort of, one sort of motivational speaker, I forget his name, but he makes this quote that I always remember. I heard it when I was a teenager, but I always remember this quote where he says, everyone wants the glory, but very few want to. So we look at, all these great people at the end point, but very few people want to actually.
Can you repeat that? You froze up for a minute. Very few want glory, but
everyone wants the glory
to make the effort.
Everyone.
But very few people want to live the story.
Oh, live the story.
Okay.
Right. All of the hardship and ache and pain that it took to get to that point, right, is sort of set aside, right? And we as Muslims, if we want to have that prophetic community, we have to somehow be willing to live the story. And that's the only way, right? That is the radical way towards what we're looking for as a community.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
I wanted to address something quickly that Amina mentioned, the darkness, and that we can subtly engage in a subtle form of racism by seeing African-American history is just so dark and gloomy and painful that we create the image of the perpetual victim, and we strip any subjectivity of the community. So yeah, it was pain, but there was a lot of parties interspersed with that pain. There was family reunions. Right after slavery, people walked across the South to find family members that were sold off. So there was tremendous triumphs of the human spirit that humanize and uplift our history and empowers us to see that despite the pain, despite the institutional pressures and realities and structures and racism and white supremacy, there were tremendous, incredible triumphs of the human spirit. There were people who overcame those odds to accomplish incredible things academically, institutionally, building institutions that are here to this very day. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's pain and there's parties. So, and we should never forget that when we look at the history. There was bleeding, but there was a lot of bandaging up those wounds, both on ourselves and on others, and then getting on with life. So may Allah give us tawfiq to see the full picture of the history. And then in seeing the full history, then we see our fellow Muslims and our fellow people in this country who've been oppressed, certainly, but we see a human being that has the power to overcome, and with some help and assistance to really rise and shine. But there's a lot to be proud of, and there's a lot that's instructive in terms of how others can overcome and and maintain. I know there's a very famous activist in New York, not Linda Sarsour. On February 12th, she had to go to work and she took her hijab off. She said she went to the subway platform. She saw her African-American sister there with full hijab. Same thing she had on September 10th. She had on September 12th. She said, she put her hijab back on and said, like, if she could do it, I can do it. And so if we can overcome the brutality of slavery and maintain our human dignity, anybody can do it. And so no one, anyway.
Yeah, no, mashallah, thank you. Thank you, Mansa. This is partly why the second webinar is one of my favorite webinars, where we talked about African-American institutions, thought leaders, academics, scholars. And I really hope that people revisit that particular webinar, because we talked about the development and the accomplishments and the growth. Speaking to what Imam Abu Khadir Al-Amin said earlier, hey, we're not waiting for anyone to come in. We've been doing it. We've survived, all this history, and we continue to grow. And we hope that we can all join together and be united in that growth and development. So with that, Ishaq, if you could put up the slide, because I want to have people just kind of know what's out there. We hope people have enjoyed this series and we'll come back to it. But I wanted to let everyone know that there are two events that I think would be worth your while. One is Anti-Racism Webinar 101 by Muslim Arc, which is a wonderful organization that does this work. This is what their core competency is. This is the work that anti-racism work is not ING's core competency, but we felt that it was important for us as children of immigrants to take the initiative to do this work, as Ishaq pointed out, and as many people have pointed out to us, that it's important for the immigrants, for the Arabs in the South Asia, to take the initiative to address anti-racism in their communities. They have two webinars, September 16th or September 20th, and this is where you can register. You can just pause the screen when you view this again to get this information. And we also recommend that every American Muslim institution in the country to hold anti-racism sessions for your organization, even if you think you're woke, that you're not a racist. It's actually really important. If you actually think this way, then it becomes really important for you to hold this, because I thought the same. And I shared my story. I confessed, my experiences with this. And it wasn't until I read White Fragility. And I was actually reading that book to help me understand the white folks that I was speaking to about Islamophobia. I had no idea that I would be impacted by it the way that I was. And so, I recommend that. And there are a lot of other books that I think Muslim Arc could probably recommend. And then the other is, and maybe Dr. Jamila, could you speak to this? I've studied with Dr. Bilal Ware. I've attended some of his classes, but could you just sort of speak to what this event is about? If you're still on. Yeah, go ahead.
So we just started a program, Invisible Muslim, Africa, and Black people, Black history, and Islam. And we started today, we launched our first course, the Africa in the Quran. And we're running alongside this course, Africa in the Quran, African Muslim scholars. And then in October, we're going to have two sessions. One is the Black Sahaba, and the second is the African or Muslim movements from Africa to the Americas. And we have Dr. Bilal Ware, myself, Angelica Lindsay Ali, and Yusuf Carter, Rashida Saida James, Dawood Walid, Aisha Prime, Imam Mendiz, and I think that's everyone. So we really encourage you to join us as we explore what Imam Muhammad talks about, especially in the African Quran course, but all of the courses, as we talk about these sacred stories, how it's so important that we see ourselves in those stories. And it's just beautiful to see how, it's always revealing itself and manifesting these insights as we're experiencing and as we're growing. So yeah, so this would just further this this pursuit for taqwa and anti-racism.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Dr. Jamila. Any other suggestions for people to watch? There was a couple of sessions by Medina Institute that did quite a bit of webinars on history of Black Muslims in the United States, but I couldn't find the links, which is why I don't have it up. But if anybody else has any suggestions for people to continue their study on this issue, please share. If not, then we'll go ahead and end here and thank all of our speakers once again for contributing to this wonderful series. It's going to continue to play on our Facebook. It's already been viewed by about 250,000 people, and we're gonna continue to keep it up there, and we're probably going to also push it out on YouTube. Right now, it's only available on Facebook, but I think we put it up on YouTube as well, and so we'll inform people on how to access that as well. So
yeah, they're all up on YouTube on our YouTube page.
They're also, okay, wonderful, thank you. With that, Amina, I'm going to ask Amina Jandali to go ahead and do a closing dua and bid everyone a good night or a good day, depending on when you're watching.
I'm just going to end with a couple of the ayat or verses of the Quran. One of them has been referenced a lot, and then a common dua, surah or chapter from the Quran. So the first one is from chapter 49:13, where it says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, O humankind, we have created you from a single male and female and made you into races and tribes for you to get to know one another. The most noble of you in the sight of God is those who are the most conscientious, and God is omniscient, fully aware. And then the second one is in chapter 30, verse 22, where it says again, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. And among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the difference of your languages and colors. Verily, in that are indeed signs for men of sound knowledge. And finally, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Indeed, by time, humans are in a state of loss, except for those who believe and those who do good works. So inshallah, this will be a testimony for all of us in our good works, and inshallah, it will enable us all to go out and to make a better world and to make a more unified ummah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.